fights in a funeral. This first point is still up for debate, as many historians are still trying to confirm how this whole gladiator thing started, but one possible launching point for these bloody Olympics was a blood rite at funerals. They served as a kind of violent eulogy, so instead of standing up in front of the mourning families and reading, I don't know, like a haiku or a poem, they fought out their feelings. Healthy. When esteemed aristocrats died, families would hold bouts between slaves beside the grave, like right there. Front row seat for the corpse. This was to demonstrate the virtues that were demonstrated by the dead in life. This presentation of blood in battle also could have stood in for human sacrifice. As you can guess, the tradition would gather quite the crowd and eventually evolved into the epic gladiator battles we know today. Julius Caesar, for instance, organized a massive gladiator fight between hundreds of warriors to honor the death of his father. By the end of the 1st century BC, the gladiator games were state-funded and much, much larger. Number 9. Diet and exercise. Living among the Spartans was essentially like living on a diet and exercise retreat in California with all the hippie moms who were like, it's okay, I can just eat an almond and then feel great. And you could never leave. In order to prepare soldiers for the scarcity of war, they doled out rations that were always just like slightly not enough, just slightly insufficient and very bland. I mean, psychologically, if you are building machines for war, probably a smart idea not to make them used to indulgence and make them resourceful. But they were raised with a specific kind of hatred for anyone who did not maintain their physique and diet. If you didn't maintain yourself at peak physical fitness, then you ran the risk of public ridicule and even being banished from the city-state. But they did drink wine, however they were very strict against inebriation and would even get their servants drunk to show the dangers of it. Number 8. Vegetarians. So believe it or not, the diet of a gladiator was largely vegetarian, though it wasn't really like they had any choice. It was expensive to keep these fearsome warriors, and meat wasn't always easy to come by, so they had to fill in the gap with other sources. Based on the excavation of 22 gladiators, their bones revealed that their typical food was wheat, barley, and beans. How they could tell this from their bones, no idea. Science, man. There was little sign of any meat or even dairy as well. However, they did drink another kind of mysterious substance. This study was carried out by the Medical University of Vienna in Austria and the University of Bern in Switzerland. And not only did it reveal the aforementioned vegetarian diets, it also showed evidence that they consumed a health-boosting tonic made out of plant ashes. It can be compared to the way we consume magnesium tablets or vitamin C. It was believed that it helped restore gladiators after a battle. Now obviously 22 is a pretty small sample size, but hey, that's still at least that percentage, so. Number 7. Marriage. Marriage. Marriage is what brings us together today, especially if you are 30. On top of training as a warrior your whole life, Spartan men were forced to be married by the age of 30. If they got married before then, they'd still have to live separately from their wives in an all-male commune. So if they wanted to see their bride, they had to have their mates cover for them and sneak out at night. But it was considered a failure as a Spartan man to not produce heirs, especially sons, back into the population. Now women usually got married at the same time as men, about 18-19, which was typically older than other civilizations. But they weren't forced into it. Both men and women had to be equal to each other and approve of their physical health and fitness of their partners. Spartans saw marriage as a means of making more Spartans, so if it ended up you couldn't do it, you had to find a partner who could. In some cases, both men and women would have multiple partners with multiple children who would belong to all. This is where it gets weird. The night before the marriage, the women had to dress up as men, have their heads shaved, and they were left in a dark room until their man, like their suitor, came into the room and kidnapped them. Number 6. Aphrodisiac. The fanaticism around gladiator warriors was like the fanfare around the Beatles, the Stones, and Justin Bieber, like all around, all combined. You might even argue that they were some of the very first celebrities, and that was mostly due to their sex appeal. They were sex bombs. Ooh, beefy men. Yeah. Roman women believed that even their sweat was an aphrodisiac, like Old Spice deodorant. The gladiators won massive fame and even had their own action figures, as children would make their clay dolls emanating their favorites. Their image would be placed on walls in public spaces and even endorsed products. Women wore hair jewelry dipped in gladiator blood or mixed their sweat into hair cream or cosmetics. To have a dream about one was said to foretell a fortunate marriage. There was even graffiti in Pompeii that depicted one fighter who would catch women in his nets at night. Like a sexy boogeyman. Ooh. Number 5. Spartan women. Okay, so Athenian women were kind of locked up in the house, didn't really have much freedom, but Spartan women were actually against the grain as to what was expected of women around that time. They ate as much as men, which was unusual. They weren't forced into marriage as soon as they were able to, so instead of being a mother at 14, it'd be more like 19 or 20 as previously mentioned. They were educated to similar standards of men. They were active and physically strong, which met criticism from outside societies because they would show off their bodies like, oh my god, her thigh, or she'd be naked, whoa, oh my goodness, like all this stuff. The Spartans believed that the stronger and more intelligent the woman, the better the male offspring would be. Spartan moms were terrifying too. They were really witty and they could like serve you up real quick. Spartan women were also prized for their wit and intellect. They could own and manage property and were proficient in reading, writing, music, and poetry. They were also expected to participate in athletic competitions such as javelin throwing and wrestling, singing, and dancing. The Spartans loved to dance because it showed off the goods. This was also a kind of advertisement to Spartan men to evaluate the mother of their hopefully next son. Child rearing was to women what war was to men. The only way to get your name on a grave was if you died in battle and died in childbirth. Number 4. Women fought as gladiators. This was news to me. I wouldn't do it because tiny. As we might have already established, gladiators were usually built from slaves, warriors, and sometimes even volunteers. Good for you. And apparently women were not exempt from that. Female slaves were quite frequently condemned to face their fate in the arena, though some volunteered because, you know, there were Xena warriors. Some of the time it was as genuine contenders, while some were sent simply for the entertainment or embarrassment. Emperor Domitian, for example, loved to pit women against people with dwarfism because he thought it was funny. Neither the women or the little people were taken seriously, as few appeared to have proven themselves in combat. However, some still did, rest assured. The timeline as to when they started doing this is unclear, but there are records of at least 2 women referred to as Amazon and Achillea. Epic names, right? Whoa. They are depicted on a marble relief dating back to the 2nd century AD, and it says that they fought in an honorable draw. Women also joined in the animal hunts, but by 200 AD their participation ended when Emperor Septimus Severus banned them in the games. Damn you, Severus Snape! Number 3. Cryptia. Obviously, where there were slaves, a lot of people not cool with it, not gonna be happy, obviously, because it was the worst. You weren't considered human. So of course, uprising and rebellion is a natural byproduct of treating people like crap. So any teenage boys who demonstrated intense leadership skills would be selected for the secret police called the Cryptia. Their primary goal was to terrify the helots into submission and weed out any growing rebellions and troublemakers. If they did find any, then they wouldn't even get a fair trial before they were executed. Pretty damn brutal, and follows quite closely the patterns of slavery across the world. However, some scholars say that the Cryptia was also yet another test for the Spartan youth. After intense training, which we will talk about in a minute, they would join the Cryptia, the kind of next step in educational training. Participating in the human practice of punishing helots was part of their learning to become a great Spartan. Number 2. Are you not entertained? Great title, I know. Fun fact, gladiators for the most part didn't actually try and kill each other in the ring, just like wound. Yeah, take a second to digest that beside the Hollywood movies you know and love. But the truth was, gladiators had a code they had to follow, and killing each other wasn't a part of it. Why? Well, because gladiators were expensive investments, and seeing your prize fighter that you like forked hundreds and thousands of dollars into die in a fight would hurt your wallet big time. Also, most of them knew each other and were besties, so they didn't even want to. Contests were usually single combat between 2 even opponents, and referees oversaw the whole thing. If one got injured enough, the ref would probably just, you know, call it. Often enough, the bout would end after both participants gave an entertaining show and would leave with honor. They were like, yeah, you're entertained, good, we're gonna go, right? Cool. However, their life expectancy was still short. Historians estimate that gladiators had 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 chance of ending up dead after the bout, either from being killed or wounded, gangrene, you know the whole deal.
And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, naval battles. Okay, so I mentioned the Aquaman gladiators with the nets and the, pokey poke tridents. That's absolutely insane, but have you heard about the staged naval battles? What a spectacle this would have been. The Colosseum was once flooded, which I'm sure took a hot minute or two. Then these ships would come out, and then it would be like medieval times, but with a splash zone, right? These ships were designed to resemble these vessels from famous battles, but the bottom of the ship was flat because the water was only 5 feet deep. Can't have the bottom of the ship scraping against all that sand and bones and stuff. No, you'll get stuck. The water was only 5 feet deep, so obviously they couldn't use real ships. It wasn't always violent reenactments either. Sometimes they would fill the Colosseum and nude synchronized swimmers would come out. Nice. Nothing like an in-ground pool filled with gladiator bones. Also, goggles weren't invented until the 14th century, so yuck. These naval battles were doing so well that Emperor Domitian devoted an entire lake to them. It's kind of like Harry Potter Goblet of Fire. They would just go to this lake and then watch these insane battles or performances, Hashtags Slytherin, I don't know. Once the shows moved over there permanently, they then used the floodgates and trapdoors to hide animals inside of. What a nice upgrade. What a show. Also, this is terrifying.
At number 10, population. It's pretty messed up just how many slaves there were in ancient Rome. In their society, wealthy people owned dozens, if not hundreds of slaves to do their menial work. In ancient Rome, anyone could be sold into slavery. No matter your race or background, if you could work, you could be bought and sold. Historians believe that about 90% of the free people in Italy by the 1st century BCE had ancestors who were slaves. At one point, the Roman Senate debated having slaves wear uniforms to be able to distinguish them from the rest of society, but they ultimately decided against it when they realized just how many slaves there were. One ancient Roman politician once said, quote, "It was once proposed in the Senate that slaves should be distinguished from free people by their dress, but then it was realized how great a danger this would be if our slaves began to count us." End quote. They literally couldn't afford to let the slaves know how many other slaves there were, because if they would have known they outnumbered the other members of society, this could have led to a revolt. I mean, there were slave revolts regardless, but we will get to that later.
Number 9. No heckling. When the Colosseum was built in 80 AD, about 50 to 80,000 fans of Roman combat, they would pour in. The energy was high. This was their only source of entertainment, really. They weren't watching The Witcher Season 2 back then, so they had to do this. So some fans would get so into the action that they, of course, would heckle. Well, just like a comedy show, they too can hear you heckle. You're throwing off their entire performance, and that's a no-go. Today, a 21-year-old usher will politely ask you to keep it down, but in Roman Colosseum days, you don't get a warning. One of Rome's more violent emperors, Domitian, was pretty die-hard when it came to the Colosseum and the games. So much so that one day, a guy in the crowd heckled a gladiator, probably talked smack about his oiled up abs, or smile. That's always a fun one, we hear that a lot. So Domitian had him pulled from the audience to the center of the arena where a group of aggressive dogs finished him off. How terrifying is that? No heckling, ever, even now, stop.
Hey Taylor!
Yeah?
Stop! Number 8, hazing and fighting. Today, we know bullying is bad. I hate it, you hate it. Kids are so mean. Like so mean! And it seems to be an everlasting battle trying to teach people not to be to each other. I don't know, it's just really hard, man. Why can't we just all be nice and get along? But in the Spartan world, hazing and fighting was encouraged. It all goes back to being ready for war mentality. Grown soldiers would often stir up strife and conflict between children in order to toughen them up. Those who showed signs of cowardice, timidity, weakness in general, they would be punished severely. After all, there is no room for retreat in front of the enemy. So literally, while you're getting bullied by your peers, your teacher comes over and joins in.
Number 7. Death before combat. With most of these Roman gladiators, they are trained, they understand a specific style of combat, and they're paired off with an opponent that's somewhat equal. But not all of these gladiators are UFC fighters. Not all of them are Russell Crowe, okay? A great amount of gladiators were criminals who were forced to fight each other in the name of entertainment. These prisoners of war were not really on board with fighting a lion with a dagger. They understood that this was probably a one-way trip, so many of them took their own lives before the combat even began. This one story is haunting, but it makes total sense. 29 prisoners were all set to fight these crazy animal battles in front of thousands, but they all ended up strangling each other. They took each other's lives because that was easier to them than walking into this nightmare. That's horrible. The reason this was an easier choice to make was because saying no would lead to an even more painful and still public execution.
Number 6, Messenian helots. So, I previously mentioned that men were banned from having another job besides being a warrior. Though they were educated, they couldn't do anything else besides train. How did anyone get anything done? Well, the women were educated and free most of the time, and completed a lot of the work, but the main source of work came from the Messenian helots, aka their slaves. The Spartans invaded and conquered their next door neighbors, subjugated them, and made them slaves. They were like, we're gonna go train all day, ladies, we're gonna do other things, you guys are gonna cook, clean, do everything else, while we live our lives. Right. This was totally unique to the Spartans as opposed to anyone else in Greece. Their neighbors were called helots and they lived in Messina. They became the engine of Sparta for free, sadly, and they weren't treated very nicely. Though sometimes they were partied with. I don't understand. It wasn't a good time. As you can guess, slavery equals bad.
Number 5, blindfolded. Remember that last scene in the movie Dodgeball when Vince Vaughn blindfolds himself and then still wins somehow? What a moment in time. There were no dry eyes in the entire theater. But what if I told you Gladiators would also pull this trick off? Yeah, in order to get crowds to return to these massive death events, they would need to change the formula up from time to time. Sometimes they would have cheap beer nights, which helped, but a new idea that worked was referred to as andibada, where gladiators wore blindfolds during combat. They would also leave the armor inside, yeah, sometimes just battling in sandals and cloth. And you thought Marco Polo made you anxious? They would save these events for the more brutal criminals, so people weren't just forced to, wrap up their eyes and shake their legs into an arena. It was, they were bad, so it's kind of like, it was fine, I guess.
Number 4, Diamastigosis. So we know, perfection as a human being was a really big deal to the Spartans. Diamastigosis was one of Sparta's most brutal practices. It was the most extreme test of endurance and a kind of replacement for ritualistic sacrifice. Adolescents were flogged in front of an altar at the sanctuary of Artemis or Thea. It was an annual practice used as both a way to satisfy the gods and as a method of testing a boy's resistance to pain. Until their blood flowed toward the altar, the ceremony didn't stop. The teens who were up to participate in the ritual did everything they could to harden themselves against pain, though some still died as a result. Fun fact though, when the Romans invaded, they actually made this like a huge show and kind of made it like an entertainment instead of just a ritual. It was bad.
Number 3, nets for weapons. When you're walking into that arena, you're eyeing down this 8'6" beast in front of you. He has like 12 abs. It doesn't look good. His name's Gore or something terrifying. You're gonna want a Nerf bat or two. You're gonna want a weapon. Now, weapons in the Colosseum were a necessity, of course, but can you believe some gladiators would use nets to fight? Nets. Yes. Yeah, nets, like they're catching butterflies or co-hosts. This class was referred to as the Rhetari. Now their combat style was built around the ways of fishermen. Yeah, Popeye versus Maximus. Place your bets, people. Realistically, these warriors looked a lot more like Aquaman. They would fight with a trident and a net. They would take their time. They would avoid these mighty swings from these big dudes. And then when the time was right, they would just go zzz, and then they would just poke the shit out of them with a trident over and over in hopes that it would, end. It helps to be quick, but if you've seen Game of Thrones, you know that spears don't always work.
At number 2, revolts. In Roman times, slave revolts were pretty common. There have been a number of recorded slave revolts in Roman history. I mentioned the one that was led by Spartacus, but there's another pretty famous Roman slave revolt that was led by a man named Eunice. Eunice led a revolt that happened in Sicily from 135 to 132 BCE. It is said that Eunice believed himself to be a prophet and claimed to have several mystical visions. Eunice was able to persuade a number of other slaves to follow him when he performed a trick where sparks and flames came out of his mouth. They believed that he was magical, and so they followed him to try and fight back against the Roman forces. Unfortunately, they were defeated, but the example that they set is believed to have inspired yet another slave revolt in Sicily later in 104 to 103 BCE. And finally, at number 1, totally normal. Probably the most messed up thing about life as a Roman slave was just how normal slavery was in society. I mean, the Roman people were so invested in their slaves that they continuously tried to crush their revolts, and they tried everything in their power to keep them from escaping. Even the sheer number of slaves that were in their society just shows how important slavery was to them. Back then, slavery was just an unquestioned institution. For many, it was just a normal part of life, which is actually quite frightening when you think about it. There is no recorded history history of Romans ever questioning slavery in their society, and all economic, legal, and social forces in Rome at this time worked hard to try and preserve slavery as part of their society. To the ancient Romans, slaves were seen as the direct opposite of free people, which they believed was a necessary balance that they needed in their society. They never completely got rid of slavery either. Though they did try and create new rules and laws to make life as a slave more bearable, they were still bought and sold into servitude and were seen as property and lesser people. Now before I wrap things up for today, I want you guys to leave a comment down below telling me if you would ever want to go back in time and visit ancient Rome. I'm sure there was a lot in ancient Rome that people would want to see and experience for themselves, so let me know your thoughts down in the comments.
Number 10. Lifelong soldiers. From the time they were born to the day they died, men were forbidden in Spartan society to be anything but a soldier. They had to live and breathe battle. How the heck did they do anything else? How'd they get their food, do their taxes, live beyond that? Well, most of the time it was the women who did it, and as well as their slaves, which we will talk about more later. So if men wanted to weave baskets or be an artist, I want to be an actor, dad, be an accountant, or literally do anything else, no go. It was forbidden by law to be anything else besides a bloodthirsty, spear-wielding, rippling-abbed hero of the Spartans. Unless you were an old dude, it stopped around when you were 60. Then you could run the politics and make all the decisions in a 3-stage process. Now some men would probably dig that, but everyone's built differently and you would be ridiculed if you weren't, I don't know, awesome at your job.
At number 9, lifestyle. Ancient Roman slaves experienced different lifestyles and living conditions based on a number of factors, often linked to their occupations. Slaves who didn't have a specific skill or trade were often used in mines and agriculture, and those were the harshest conditions that they could have been subjected to. Oftentimes, they were literally worked to death, and since they didn't have any human rights in the eyes of the Romans, they were often overlooked and simply replaced. On the other hand, household slaves received more humane treatment. They were treated better by their masters, and sometimes they were able to get some money in order to buy their freedom. If they were able to buy their freedom, the slaves would become freedmen, which was a social class between slaves and free people. Before we continue discussing the hard lives of slaves in ancient Rome, make sure you guys smash that thumbs up button if you're thoroughly entertained so far, and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, Spartacus. At one point, a group of Roman slaves revolted, and though they eventually lost their battle, they survived a pretty long time thanks to one famous slave named Spartacus. Spartacus was a slave who escaped a gladiatorial training camp and recruited thousands of other slaves to fight for their freedom alongside him. For the slaves, Spartacus was their symbol of hope and their leader. This slave army was able to defy Roman authorities for 2 years with freedom in their sights, but unfortunately those dreams were crushed when Roman general Crassus crushed Spartacus and his army. After Spartacus was killed, the authorities came for the rest of the slaves in the army, and they were severely punished. 6,000 slaves who took part in the revolt were crucified, and this was almost a warning to the other slaves against trying to revolt again. Spartacus became a legend, but it wasn't enough to free the Roman slaves. At number 7, ownership. In ancient Rome, slavery and slave ownership was such a common practice that pretty much everyone owned slaves, regardless of social status. Even some of the poorest Roman citizens would own 1 or 2 slaves. Obviously, the more money you had back then, the more slaves you could afford. In Roman Egypt, the average artisan owned about 2 or 3 slaves each. Emperor Nero was known to have owned over 400 slaves who lived and worked in his home in the city, but his numbers are eclipsed by a wealthy Roman named Gaius Caecilius Isidorus, who according to historical records owned 4,166 slaves at the time of his death. That just gives you an idea of just how many people were sold into slavery in the first place. At number 6, freedom. Earlier I mentioned that Roman slaves had the chance to buy their freedom. It was a lengthy process, but this gave a lot of slaves hope for a better life. Things weren't always better after buying their freedom though, and many of them sold themselves back into slavery because things were tough. The process of buying your freedom as a slave was called manumission. This could be achieved in a number of ways. Slave master could grant their slave freedom as a reward for their service and loyalty. The slave could pay their master a sum of money to be freed, or sometimes a slave master could just find it convenient to let their slave go. Most slave masters who chose that last option to free their slave for their own benefit were merchants who needed someone to be able to sign contracts on their behalf and since slaves weren't allowed to represent their masters from a legal standpoint, they would be freed, but would still work for their master. You also had to be over the age of 30 to buy your freedom, so if you were lucky to live that long, then there was hope of being freed, but with the average life expectancy in ancient Rome being about 28 years or so, and with the living conditions of many slaves, they would be lucky to get that opportunity. At number 5, demand. In ancient Rome, there was an incredibly high demand for slaves, but since there were so many slaves in Rome, there was always work for them. Oftentimes, people sold themselves or their children into slavery in order to pay off their debts, so when it came to being bought, that came pretty easy. Other than public office, slaves were used for almost every activity in ancient Rome. The most common slave trade was mining because workers were always in demand, mostly due to the high level of danger that came with the job, and the fact that many slaves were injured or died while working in the mines, and slave masters needed to keep replacing those who could no longer work. Domestic labor and farming were also high demand jobs for slaves back then. Back then, the logic behind using slave labor for these types of jobs was that, quote, free labor should be used in unhealthy places, end quote. Basically, they believed that it was better to have a slave pass away on the job than a free person because it would impact their business less. At number 4, procurement. The way that slaves were acquired in ancient Rome was pretty messed up, I will say. Typically, slaves were acquired through 4 different ways. They would be brought in as war captives, as victims of pirate raids, by trade, or by breeding. During the early expansion of the Roman Empire, many war captives were turned into slaves. The pirates from Sicilia, located in what is now modern-day Turkey, did business with the Romans and supplied them with a lot of their slaves. The pirates would bring their slaves to the island of Delos, which back then was considered to be the international center of slave trading. The slave trade was such a big deal back then that it has been recorded that on at least one occasion, 10,000 people were traded as slaves and shipped back to Italy in one day. This was a big business opportunity for a lot of people, but of course no one ever considered the lives of the people they were buying and selling. At number 3, fugitives. As you can imagine, life as a slave in ancient Rome, or at any period of time, wasn't easy. Living conditions were poor, it was dangerous, and no one should ever be treated like that or used for free labor. Many slaves have been known to escape, and obviously the same went for those in ancient Rome. Slaves running away from their masters was a common thing back then, and to deal with it, slave owners would hire professional slave catchers to hunt down, capture, and return the escaped slave back to their owner. For slave owners who wanted to take matters into their own hands, they would advertise rewards for those who could return their slaves, or they would just try and locate their slave themselves. Some slave owners had ways of preventing their slaves from getting away, like using collars with instructions on where to return the escaped slave, much like a dog collar, which is just dehumanizing.
Number 2, agogay training. I've hinted at this the entire time. Being a Spartan boy was hardcore. You think you're hardcore for going to the gym every day, guzzling protein shakes and lifting weights. By today's standards, you go, man. That's awesome. But compared to Spartan youths, you'd look like a Stay Puft marshmallow covered in kittens watching Disney movies. Like, that's what you'd look like. You'd be like, you soft man. Agogay was a state-sponsored compulsory education system which emphasized obedience, endurance, courage, and self-control. By the age of 7, boys were sent to live together and their training began. They used harsh and cruel methods in order to harden the hearts of their future warriors. It literally turned childhood into the breeding ground for what would be considered trauma by today's standards. At age 12, they were stripped of all clothing save a red cloak and forced to sleep outside. They had to make their own shelter, encouraged to forage and steal food for survival, but if they were caught stealing, they were punished severely. Among fierce combat training, they were also taught to read, write, music, and everything else. But by age 30, their training was complete and they were expected to marry as previously mentioned. But seriously, I didn't go into really full details because probably YouTube would get mad, but you can imagine, like, beatings, it was nuts. Not a good time. But they were awesome at fighting. Number 1, Mount Taygetus. Upon the birth of a Spartan, they went through a kind of Baptist initiation called Pieties. The infant was dumped into a vat of wine, and if they cried, they were considered weak. This last one is honestly truly the most messed up and super metal at the same time. It's really bad. The Spartan youths were first evaluated by a council of elders. In the event they didn't meet their expectations, the babe was placed at the bottom of Mount Taygetus for several days. If they survived, they were celebrated and taken back to the village. If they died from exposure, the corpse was left behind. The third option was that the babe disappeared via sympathetic passerby, which did happen. The parents had to endure this testing of fate, for only a true Spartan could survive the impossible. This list was super fun to make. Crazy, but fun. My last fact about Sparta is that all the info I just presented to you didn't come from Sparta. Everything we know about Sparta came from records from exterior states who interacted with Sparta. They didn't write anything down about themselves, so who knows what else we do or do not know.